Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kevin Young. I'm a member of the Steering Committee of Historians for Peace and Democracy. We're one of the groups who organized this event alongside our partners at Convergence. We're going to put the links to both of our organizations in the chat within the next minute or two. So we organized this event and we're calling it Troops in the Street. What does an authoritarian takeover look like? And obviously, it's a live issue. We're seeing what's going on around the country right now and around the world. And so we're living in a particularly urgent moment right now. So we thought it was an important moment to come together and discuss these problems. So we have two speakers who I'm going to introduce in a moment. We have three questions that we asked them to think about, and that we're going to try to structure the conversation around these three. So the first is, what does an authoritarian takeover look like? Second, how have authoritarian takeovers been effectively resisted? And third, what can we do to resist one today? So those are the three questions. We have with us Barbara Ransby and Barbara Weinstein. So I'll just give you a bit of information about each of them before we turn it over to them. So Barbara Ransby is an historian, writer, and longtime Black feminist activist. She is author of 3 books, including the multi-award-winning Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision. In addition to teaching and research, she works with a number of progressive and solidarity organizations. And then I'll introduce the other Barbara before we get into the initial presentations. Barbara Weinstein is Silver Professor of History at New York University and past president of the American Historical Association. She's also on the Steering Committee of Historians for Peace and Democracy, and has written a number of very important books and articles in the field of Brazilian history. And so we're very fortunate to have both of these speakers with us today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing their presentations and the conversation between them. So we're going to structure the session in a way that allows each of them to make brief presentations or remarks in response to these questions, and then they'll have a chance to respond to each other. And we're going to do 2 iterations of that cycle. So I'll pose the initial questions. They'll each speak for about 5 minutes or so, and then the 2 Barbaras can speak to each other directly. But there will be a chance for audience questions. So during the event, throughout, you can be entering your questions in the online form here. So we'll put instructions about how to do that in the chat in a moment. All right, so let's move on to the first set of questions here. What does an authoritarian takeover look like? And how have authoritarian takeovers been effectively resisted? And I was thinking we would go alphabetically. So we would start with Barbara Ransby, and then we'll go to Barbara Weinstein. So Barbara Ransby.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Happy to be on this panel. I think these kinds of forums are really important in this period when we are all being told to shut up and behave. So having a conversation about history and also about the, as Dr. King would say, fierce urgency of now. When we ask that question, what does an authoritarian takeover look like? I'm in Chicago, and it looks like what I'm seeing outside my window, to tell you the truth. People have been reading in the national media and certainly seeing on social media what's been happening in Chicago. So we have like a textbook definition of what does authoritarianism look like. And then we have the material reality that's playing out before our eyes, right? However in denial we might want to be about it. Here in Chicago, there have been nighttime raids on apartment buildings on the south side of Chicago with helicopters and flash bombs and children being brought outside in their pajamas in handcuffs and zip ties for a handful of people that were arrested for who knows why, but elders being brought out in that same raid, a virtual spectacle. People were traumatized. Silverio Villegas Gonzalez, a 38-year-old father of two, was shot dead in an ICE raid gone wrong here in Chicago. One of our older people, Jesse Fuentes, amazing progressive advocate in city council, was arrested at a local hospital trying to ask questions of federal agents who were there to detain a man who was in the hospital, and Jesse kept saying, I'm just trying to ask a question. So that's what authoritarianism looks like on the ground. Now, the sort of dictionary definition is it's, kind of a regime that advocates strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom, hyper-nationalism, moving beyond the rule of law. We know that right-wing dictatorships of the mid-20th century and the fascist regimes of Europe have a certain set of characteristics. But I want to also emphasize, when we try to offer a definition, we're historians, so we understand it's time, place, and conditions. So Hitler and Mussolini and Franco had characteristics different from each other. And certainly here in the 21st century in the United States, there are different characteristics. A couple of them I want to mention that don't always get mentioned is the racist aspect of this current assault on democracy, if you will, flawed democracy and fraud, as it were. But the racist nature of it, the white Christian nationalist movement that's been growing in this country that the current president has embraced, vilifies people of color, vilifies not all immigrants, but Black and brown immigrants in particular, working class Black and brown immigrants in this country. And it has been those people who've been targeted as aliens, as polluting the blood of the country. It's Black communities that have been targeted as being crime infested and needing an occupation, et cetera. So that racist nature of the current authoritarian regime, I think, is very important. And sometimes we talk about, when we talk about resistance, we talk about the need for unity, but I think we have to talk about principled unity, which means naming all of what we're up against. The other thing I'll say, as someone who studies the Black freedom movement in this country, we did have racial authoritarianism in this country after slavery. I mean, certainly the antebellum South, you could say, is a form of authoritarianism. But the nearly 100 years of Jim Crow subjugation was a kind of authoritarian regime where Black people were subjected to state-sanctioned vigilante terror. They were banned from many areas of public life and denied basic rights and protections. And a public culture vilified and dehumanized, Black people. My parents and grandparents who lived in Georgia and Mississippi in that era were a part of that and had that experience. So these are some of the flashpoints or some of the highlights of what we think of when we think of authoritarian regimes. I think it's really, I don't know if we want to combine these questions or take them separately, but how do we resist, or how have people resisted? And I think certainly it's varied, and Barbara is certainly an expert on Latin America. But when we think of how people have resisted, say, fascism in Europe, and sometimes we collapse fascism and authoritarianism. Fascism is a very specific form of authoritarianism, and I think this regime in the United States right now actually has characteristics resembling 20th century European fascism. The hyper-militarism, the misogyny and patriarchy, romanticizing militarism. I'm utterly chilled by some of the comments that Pete Hegseth has made. We want maximum lethality, not tepid legality, as one that stands out. So, what does that mean? That means maximize killing people and don't worry about the laws. So, these are classic characteristics of a certain kind of fascist regime, and it's very dangerous, and we have to take it seriously. The other thing I will say, a characteristic of this regime is, just blatant kleptocracy, just crude money-making efforts on the part of the Trump family, taking advantage of his position as president. So, all of these are characteristics. How do we resist? How do we fight back? How do people fight back? Every way possible on multiple fronts. And I will say, people are fighting back. We think of, No King's Day, which occurred in June, millions of people in the street all over the country. It's coming up again on October 18th. So there are those mass protests. There's also May Day Strong, which occurred in around the country, led by labor unions. There were the hands-off protests. So as long as we can, and in other places this was true as well, as long as we can, I think we have to resist in public. We have to resist succumbing to fear. Large gatherings, small gatherings, visual, vocal condemnation and opposition to what's happening, and to resist preemptive compliance. And I think that's what a lot of university leaders, have to really make sure they do. So there is resistance on the legal front. It's an ebb and flow, and the courts are stacked. We know that, but there have been some legal victories. There have been some electoral victories. Zoran Mamdani in New York is a very exciting development, I think. It's kind of beat all the odds, speaking to people fearlessly, honestly, unapologetically, and people are responding, and against all kind of money and all kinds of maligning. Those are the kinds of victories I think that we need to hold up and celebrate. I might stop there. So, essentially, many complete fascist regimes, and when authoritarian power is consolidated, people can't protest publicly. So there have been all kinds of covert underground efforts in many dictatorships, and some of my own friends from Latin America experienced that, either going into exile or going underground, when legitimate, legal, and even nonviolent resistance and protest was outlawed. That people had to secretly and surreptitiously resist regimes, and also to garner pressure from outside of those countries. So that certainly has been the practice, but this regime has not fully consolidated its power. We still can protest. We should protest. And I'll say a little bit more about that later before we wrap up. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a really helpful way to start the discussion, framing, as you say, some of what we're up against, right? Beginning to name it, and calling attention to some of the resistance that's already happening, that we need to pay attention to and build on. So I'll pass the mic over to Barbara Weinstein.
Okay. First, I want to thank Historians for Peace and Democracy for putting this together, and I want to thank Barbara for her opening comments, which I think were exactly the kind of comments that we need to, think of things that we need to think about. I will talk in a somewhat different direction as a Latin Americanist, but I'm hoping that it'll be clear sort of how the two different perspectives are both really useful for us at this moment. So, thinking about what an authoritarian takeover looks like. I mean, I live in New York, so Chicago gives you a vantage point right now that actually, happily, we do not have at the moment in New York, or nearly as much. New York at the moment seems like an island of peace and tranquility, and with the likelihood, I'll be optimistic, of Mayor Mamdani in the future, it's definitely feels like we're living in this very pleasant bubble for the moment, but I don't know how long that will last. But I have lived in societies that were either in the process of going in an authoritarian direction, or that were living under authoritarian regimes. And during my very first week in graduate school, With the first week was the other 9/11, as some people have called it, the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile by the military. So I have a pretty good idea of what a classic authoritarian takeover looks like. I mean, it literally, in the case of Brazil, was tanks going down the main avenues of the major cities. So it looked exactly like every sort of Hollywood movie's notion of what an authoritarian takeover looks like. But even in the cases of Latin America that seemed like the classic coup d'etat, the classic golpe do Estado, um, it's not, it's interesting to think about the way in which prior to the moment that the military seizes power, uh, the society had already started moving in certain directions that were authoritarian. And so that it's really not the onset of the regime that is the military seizure of power, but a kind of culmination of a process. So, for example, in Brazil, you had repeated attempts by the military to intervene in politics prior to the seizure of power in '64. You had mass demonstrations by the pro-military right-wing civilians urging the military to seize power. The same thing happened in Chile. In Argentina, the previous administration, the elected government prior to 1976, prior to the onset of the proceso, the really extraordinarily violent military regime that took power. Prior to that was an elected government that staged an all-out war, which I think can legitimately be called a dirty war against any opposition, particularly the armed opposition, but not only the armed opposition, so that by the time the military took power, in fact, much of the opposition had been crushed. So, this is just to say that, the actual seizure of power by an authoritarian regime, which is what we tend to have in mind when we think about a society going authoritarian, is really, it is typically preceded by a kind of deterioration of democracy. Probably the most extreme example is Uruguay in Latin America, which had had a very long history of democracy, and where the elected president basically collaborated with and then handed over, without any ostensible pressure, handed over the government to the military. So we don't, troops in the streets are one sign of authoritarian regime in the making or having taken power, but you don't necessarily have to have troops in the street or have them everywhere for a regime to go in that direction. Oh dear, I've already been talking for 5 minutes. Okay, I will skip. I was going to talk a little bit about the parliamentary coup in Brazil, where Dilma Rousseff, who had been elected twice as president, was impeached on very spurious charges, I would say. And then Lula is simultaneously prosecuted and imprisoned so that he can't run for president, so that you have a situation where there are no troops involved. There's no military in the streets, and yet they overturned an elected president and impeded the most popular politician in Brazil from running for election. So sometimes you can have a change of regime without any military intervention at all. But what is interesting to think about is when Jair Bolsonaro wanted to prevent Lula, who had just won the election, from taking office, he knew he had to have the military on his side to do that.
Yeah.
That was not something that he could do without the military. And so you needed, and he knew that he needed the military to support him, which they ended up, a significant portion did not. And he even contemplated, they were contemplating assassination of Lula. So there are situations where you need to have troops on your side, and sometimes where the levers of democracy, supposed democracy, can be used to produce an authoritarian outcome. And what we can do to resist one, I think, maybe I'll roll this into the next discussion of resistance, and let Kevin step in.
Great.
Barbara, I wanted to respond to some of what you said. I would like to hear the longer piece, because the details are important, how it plays out so differently in different places. There's not a formulaic answer.
Yeah.
In many activist circles lately, and people ask, how long does it last for authoritarian forces to consolidate power? It varies, right? And those the kernels are there. And I think the scariest thing about this moment, which also speaks to this question of the kind of resistance that's required, is it ultimately is a hearts and minds struggle. I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the threat of military force is always there, right? If people oppose, but to have a popular movement that is either actively supporting or passively supporting the rise of an authoritarian dictator is the most powerful tool and leverage they have. And here, of
absolutely,
course, Trump and his forces have manipulated a sector of the population, into accepting, or at least believing the kind of promises and scenarios he's offering, as well as the scapegoating of particularly immigrants and, Marxists and communists that he's, conjured up in his little brain. But anyway, yeah, so those different paths are, I think, important, with the threat of force kind of underlying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to think about in Brazil and other Latin American countries, who is the who plays the role of undocumented immigrants in the United States, because Brazil doesn't have an immigration issue, or not significant enough. So what has returned, what has been revived, is that Lula's a communist, Dilma was a communist, his supporters are communists, and so on. So that's been kind of the most kind of public. But the other thing, of course, is the racism under Bolsonaro. And the racism toward Afro-Brazilians, towards indigenous Brazilians, so that had to be, but it's interesting because even in that context, because of Brazil's longstanding, not Brazil, but certain portions of Brazil's longstanding claim that it's a racial democracy, he had to kind of modulate that so that it didn't seem like he was simply being anti-Black. So, and a significant portion of, people who I think self-identify as Black or brown in Brazil did vote for Bolsonaro. So, it's a very complicated situation in terms of, how to address that, how to address the issue. And I think there's some elements similar to the significant Latino vote that Trump got in the last election. So, the parallels between Brazil and the United States. I mean, Lula is in office in Brazil, so that's a big difference. But I think the parallels in terms of the right wing are very striking.
And a very strong Black feminist movement there that has been targeted and has been very forceful in resistance. And then, of course, MST.
Yeah, I mean, there are very strong, and particularly under Bolsonaro, there were very strong resistance movements. But I also I don't want to understate the role of the Brazilian Supreme Court in supporting democracy. I mean, it was really crucial at a particular moment that they both, at one moment, they voided Lula's conviction and restored his right to run for election. And then at another moment, convicted Jair Bolsonaro of attempting to overthrow the government. And so, I mean, it's kind of ironic after many, many years of kind of having to teaching Latin American, Brazilian history, and having students ask me, like, why aren't there institutions as strong as, institutions in the United States? And, saying, well, maybe our institutions aren't so strong, but now, I mean, clearly there are certain things happening in Brazil that are not happening here in terms of the judicial system. I mean, at the local level, the judicial system has been doing that, but at the federal level, not at all. The Supreme Court, not at all. So, Kevin?
Well, thank you both. I think you've already started to go in the direction that we wanted to go in next, to think a little bit more in the present about what resistance right now looks like, what it could look like. What lessons do you take from history and from your recent observations of popular struggles? About what can be effective in resisting the descent into authoritarianism. We'll start with Barbara Ransby again.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about this question, and I wish I could say, we will win and here's the way forward. But it's not as simple as that. So I think there are a number of things to remember. One is that, there's the popular slogan, when we fight, we win. If only that were true. We don't always win when we fight, but here's the thing. When we fight collectively, strategically, and persistently, we move the needle on freedom and justice. That's for sure. Related to that, I think we have to always ask, what is winning? And it's never absolute, even when we think it is, even when we claim, we've won, we realize not so fast. So I think in this period, as dictators all over the world, they often start to believe their own hype and go, a step too far, a mile too far. They always overstep. And I think, Trump has attacked so many people. So many people have been politicized in this moment, feel the need to be engaged in this moment, and really are ready to be involved in activity. And I think we have to take advantage of that. As academics and as historians, it's important that we fight where we are and that we not be isolated and we link to the larger resistance movements that are out there. But the university is a key site of struggle in this moment. And something we didn't mention before is in all these regimes, the university and intellectuals, from Chile to Turkey to the Philippines to Brazil, universities, academics, intellectuals, have been at the center. In South Africa, the struggle against apartheid, a different type of authoritarian regime. Students were on the front line and were targeted. So, I think there's a lot to do on our campuses, defending our students, particularly defending those students who had the moral courage to speak out in solidarity with Palestine, to push back against the gutting of institutions like the Smithsonian, to defend our international colleagues who are being harassed and threatened, and to use organizations like AAUP to join them. One of the things we have to struggle against in mobilizing and organizing with our colleagues is that part of our training as academics is, we do collaborations and we co-write things and this sort of thing. But it is somewhat of an isolated path, as historians in particular, we go into the archives and we're there for long periods of time and we write our books and so forth. And I do really think in this moment, we all have to be organizers and we all have to take serious the historical significance of this moment, the urgency of this moment. I mean, this is really, this is not abstract, and it's going to affect our lives. It's going to affect our neighbors' lives. It's going to affect our students' lives. So, to feel the boldness and to find our courage and to connect with each other in this moment, I think is really absolutely key. And there are many organizations that are doing this kind of work. Of course, Historians for Peace and Democracy is one of them. AAUP I mentioned. Indivisible, Rising Majority, even groups like the ACLU, who are primarily doing litigation and public awareness, people can join and support. So I think being in collective spaces, as long as we can be in collective spaces, is really important, and not engaging in preemptive compliance. This idea of keep your head down until the dust settles. That is a dead end if ever there was one. So I think I'll stop there and see what the other Barbara has to say.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, Barbara. I think you started off with the realistic comment. There's that wonderful slogan: "The people united will never be defeated." It's not.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's really true, but it's a good.
I want to believe it, and
that.
I have chanted that slogan, I must say.
Yeah. But what I do think is sort of really been difficult for me in what's been happening in some places in Latin America, but particularly in the US, is that a lot of things that I thought were a done deal, like things that were accomplished by, I don't know if I'd say the left, but by progressive movements, were so firmly established and so widely embraced that they couldn't be reversed. And so what's been a little bit horrifying is, or not more than a little bit, is how quickly certain things have been reversed, how quickly certain things that seemed unimaginable now become, if not imaginable, just reality. And going back to the details of the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, I think there's something we can learn from the run-up to it, which is when the more conservative majority in Congress in Brazil decided that Dilma had become unpopular enough that they could move on her and basically impeach her. And it started out with a protest that I would definitely see as a left-leaning protest, calling for free public transportation, for students, people with low incomes, and so on. And so there were these, and also protesting the expenses of hosting the World Cup and hosting the Olympics. So this started out with a kind of what we might see as a kind of left populist movement that was gradually taken over. And I think before people could even realize what was happening, by right-wing groups that started saying that, Dilma was corrupt and Dilma was spending all this money and Dilma was to blame. And there wasn't much talk anymore of free public transportation and so on. And gradually, you had these mass demonstrations, but they went from being left-leaning to right-leaning, and so it gives you a sense of how careful one has to be, because on the one hand, I think in a moment like this, we need to have a kind of broad coalition to oppose authoritarianism. On the other hand, it's very easy to imagine a situation where we think we have allies who are going to support the protection of democracy, and they end up not being so committed to democracy. And I think finally I would just say that I've been both heartened and disheartened by what's happening at universities. On the one hand, the students and many faculty and the occasional administrator have been shown a lot of solidarity with those who are being targeted by this administration. But way too many universities seem more than willing to make a deal with Trump. And so even within our own home environment, it's hard to know who you can count on as an ally and who you cannot. I'm sorry, I should be more optimistic, but
Well, I mean, I have moments of optimism in all of this. When I see protests where, people are coming out and supporting their neighbors. There was this great clip of a protest in Rochester, New York, but there've been some in Chicago
Oh,
too.
that was great.
In
Yeah.
Rochester, New York, right? The pastor, these guys
Yeah.
are up on the roof. And this
Yeah.
woman says, no, you're not going to these guys are just doing a job. You're not going to take our neighbors. And she starts calling up her parishioners and come out here and come out here. And they shame them,
Yeah.
into leaving. I mean, they did arrest one man, but they didn't arrest all of them. Just
Yeah.
people saying,
Yeah.
no, not on our watch, not on our watch.
I loved what she said when she said they're bothering them, so I
Yeah.
came here to bother
Bother
ICE.
them. Yeah, that was one of the women who came.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
was I don't know if you want to segue to the questions yet, Kevin, or if you had other questions for us, but I saw an interesting one in the chat.
Yeah. Feel free to answer.
Yeah, there was this question about anti-intellectualism and how does anti-intellectualism serve authoritarianism? I think that's a really good question and part of the frustration, I think many of us who've spent our lives talking and lecturing and teaching and writing, right? Words are our currency. So let's make this make sense. Let's debate it. Let's argue it. And when either brute force or, big mouth bullying rules the day and rules the public square, it's very hard to deploy that currency, to use that currency, right, for arguments. And it does serve authoritarianism. I mean, we've seen some of the press conferences with government officials from Washington, and the way in which name calling, refusing to answer, just the hearing the other day with, I think it was yesterday with
Pam Bondi.
Pam Bondi, I can't remember Christy Nome, Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi, where she just belligerently refused to answer questions. She didn't try to make it make sense. She didn't try to offer an explanation, or, Trump name calling the press. That's something we didn't talk about either. The attack on media is another characteristic of these kinds of regimes, and so I think we have to push for that space, and we have to create spaces where rigorous debate and discussion can still happen, right? Even if that is, fugitive space in a way, right? If that gets pushed to the margins. I mean, one of the things we're doing in Scholars for Social Justice is something we're calling the Open University, where we'll be in community spaces and teaching and debating some of the ideas that are getting marginalized in official institutions of higher learning. So I think that's really important, because, of course, in an authoritarian regime, you don't want rigorous debate. You don't want critical thinking. That's very, very scary, because then people are likely to challenge the authoritarians. So, and of course, attacking intellectuals as elites. And some institutions have been elitist, but of course,
sure.
Some of the smartest people I know are people who actually aren't academically trained intellectuals. So it's really the ideas and the engagement of the ideas that are important and that we have to continue to create space for.
Yeah. I think the issue of anti-intellectualism also, I think in the long run, the two of the areas where the most harm will be done is in the area of health.
Yeah.
And so the treatment of people who have, spent their lives. I mean, the number of people that Tony Fauci's, is alive because of Tony Fauci. I mean, it's, probably uncountable. And so then for him to become a villain, for the government, I mean, it's just, incredible. But I think even more serious is climate change and the dismantling of the EPA and somebody on the news yesterday was saying that the United States has effectively become a petro state. It's become a state that's hostile to any non-fossil fuel energy, and these are what I would hope. Is that there are certain things that are happening that will resonate, that there's a kind of MAGA base that won't budge, and I think there's no point in hoping they'll budge, but I think they just have too much big a stake in it. But I think there's a lot of people who voted for Trump who are not MAGA, and so the question is, how do we balance kind of energizing and mobilizing people who oppose Trump right off the bat, and appealing to people who, and a lot of who are working, are workers, and not high income people who voted for Trump, who are Latino, and so what are the issues that are likely to resonate most with people who in this particular election voted for a candidate like Trump, but might not always be committed to doing so.
Yeah.
So,
well, look, I mean, obviously the cuts in public services and the attack on science. I mean, this, Robert Kennedy is endangering people in ways that we would not have imagined, or all the scientific research that's being defunded. If you have a disease, it's scientific research that can prolong and give a quality of life, whatever political party you're affiliated with. And so I think those kinds of issues have to be foregrounded. And I do think it's an ethical and moral struggle too, on a certain level. And I think we have to talk to our neighbors. We have to create communities of discourse and communities of resistance, both coordinated and decentralized. If in every neighborhood there's a vigil and a reading group and a mobilization team to go out and scream in the streets if necessary, if neighbors are being taken away. I mean, these seem like very small things, but they create a culture of resistance that I think adds up.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that among the most frightening aspects of regimes that are either fully authoritarian or becoming so is the onset of the practice of malicious prosecution and illegal detention. And I think there are a lot of people
torture.
who, torture being, kind of the culmination of this. And I think that a lot of people who are willing to go along with certain aspects of what Trump is doing are bothered, are disturbed by the illegal detentions, are disturbed by malicious prosecution. And, so I think we, need to think about what are the sort of kind of stress points where, you can mobilize people, either people who have different politics from what you or I might have, but also people who are not mobilized. They might not have such different politics, but they're just, I'm kind of looking for the issue that will galvanize. I mean, a lot of people are already galvanized, and I think the next No Kings rallies on October 18th.
Yeah.
I suspect they'll be even bigger.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are galvanized, but I think there's still a kind of segment that hasn't figured out yet what
to do. Yeah. I think the thing I've appreciated by those protests, and there's a struggle in the leadership, like how big is the big tent? I mean, of course you want it to be as big as possible, but do we need to say more than just no kings? Do we need to also, call out the racism? Do we need to also speak to the genocide? Do we need to, what kinds of things do we need to speak to in that? And the thing about that last protest in June was people came with their own signs, and there was not antagonism. I mean, people had all kinds of signs and their issues, federal workers, veterans benefits, immigrant. My parent is an immigrant. I support students' right to protest. I defend education. I defend science or climate. I'm opposed to climate chaos and the evisceration of the EPA. So people had many different, and in a sense, that is a different kind of united platform. It's multi-issued, and he's attacked on so many fronts. It creates the potential for that. But what that translates into, the electoral process is flawed and has been flawed, and in terms of accountability, and quite frankly, the main leadership of the Democratic Party is more than disappointing in this moment, and not many of them not even supporting some of the most exciting young progressives who are coming into Democratic Party spaces. But I do think, all that said, the midterms are important. And I don't think it's going to be, Freedom Day or something, but it is definitely can slow things down. And I think that being strategic is important. No win is ever absolute. No loss is ever absolute. How can we delay, derail, disrupt, slow down this train so that more people can organize and more strategies can come into play.
Right. I don't know, Kevin, I don't know if you want to jump in, or there's the question about attacks on the media, attacks on universities. I don't know if I just wanted to say quickly that I think I don't want to go, it seems relatively trivial compared to some other things, but I think the response to to Jimmy Kimmel being canceled I think that was a model of, there were all kinds of protests. People, canceled their subscriptions, to Disney Plus, etc. So, there were different kinds of things. Some were actual, people in the street protesting, and some were people using their pocketbook to the power of the purse to protest. But I think that it's an example of something where there were a lot of different ways to register your protest, your opposition to what had been done. And so not everybody is going to go out into the street, but it's good to think about various ways in which people can register their discontent.
Yeah. And I think terms of engagement and solidarity is really one of the best tools against authoritarianism, because I think the strategy of repression is to pick off different groups. First of all, to target a group, and then people feel like, well, I want to distance myself from them because I don't want to get scooped up too, right? And then around issues, well, that's not my issue, so I can't unite with them. I mean, to have principled engagement around these issues, and to have room for everybody at the table, and not throw each other under the bus, which is what sometimes happens in coalition work, right? It's a fragile unity to begin with, and then this group is expendable, this group is expendable, and so forth, because the totality of this is going to affect all of us, no matter who you are. And happening on the campuses is one flashpoint. In Black and Latino communities is another flashpoint. Federal workers, science, all these are flashpoints. So the biggest tent we can build around solidarity against authoritarianism will give us wiggle room. I also fear, other various scenarios that could happen that would strengthen the hand of the authoritarian regime in power, and some of them we can't predict. So I think we also need to do scenario planning. What if this happens? What if that happens? And also talk to our neighbors, talk to our colleagues, talk to our students in ways that maybe we haven't before. Everybody, this is on everyone's mind. So it can't become the new normal. That's one thing I think it's important.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that theme of solidarity that Barbara Ransby mentioned, and ask you both if there are examples that you would point to, either historically or in the very recent past, of movements successfully building the kind of solidarity that could stop fascism and other right-wing movements. There's some interest in the audience in addressing this question. I think we got one question about building unity, right? How do we do that? And how have coalitions actually been successful in challenging authoritarianism? Either one of you.
Okay. Oh, Kevin just disappeared. But yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest, I think I can think of lots and lots of examples of successful authoritarian seizures of power. I can't think of a lot of examples of sort of successful struggles against the rise of authoritarianism. And I do think that I can think of a lot of successful struggles that ended authoritarian regimes. But I'm sort of trying to think about examples from the world that I know best that sort of put a halt to an authoritarian trend. I suppose the most recent one was the refusal to re-elect Jair Bolsonaro and then to support his attempt to stop Lula from taking office. But I think more interesting to most historians are the various ways in which progressive groups or anti-authoritarian groups in Latin America have mobilized to end authoritarian regimes. And, typically, it's been a combination of different groups, different tactics. In, Brazil, it was a classic. You had the metallurgical workers and labor in general mobilizing, calling strikes that were, illegal according to the regime, but calling strikes. You had particularly women connected to the left wing of the Catholic Church. You had sort of middle class voters who were, middle class Brazilians who were outraged that their sons and daughters were being repressed, that some of them were being imprisoned and tortured. You had a kind of series of groups that were mobilizing against the regime, and that's what it took. It wasn't going to be labor wasn't going to do it on its own. Women, left-wing Catholic women weren't going to do it on their own. The Black consciousness movement wasn't going to do it on its own. In effect, what you had is a kind of convergence of these different groups, which didn't have the exact same agenda, but they did have one thing in common. They wanted the military regime to end.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how democratic will the next phase be? But that was kind of left off to the side.
Yeah. I mean, the struggles that I'm most familiar with as a historian, certainly the Black freedom movement in this country, which I made the case earlier, we can see Jim Crow tyranny as a kind of authoritarianism in this country. It was
Absolutely.
a racialized authoritarianism. I mean, if you protested, if you dared to vote, you were likely to get a visit from the Klan in the middle of the night. And so organizations like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and eventually Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and others, and also the NAACP and many of its more activist chapters before and during the 60s, operated very carefully in a very dangerous situation. They built allies inside and outside the South. They had intergenerational meetings. They used the institutions in the community like the church. All of them weren't devout, religious people, but they used the institutions that were there. And they built, through example, they built a movement of very courageous people who stood up to that regime and who operated under very dire and dangerous circumstances. In South Africa, similarly. I will say culture is an area we haven't talked about that I think is very important in all of these movements. And currently, some of the most powerful interventions that I've seen have been cultural, interventions of the projection on the side of the building in the UK when Trump was visiting, of Trump and Epstein, to kind of illustrate the hypocrisy and the contradiction. Street theater in the middle of many of the protests that have happened here. And the late night comedy, I mean, they're certainly not the liberation forces, let's say, but they have pushed the envelope in a very, powerful way, and in a way that has been accessible to large numbers of people who, don't read books about authoritarianism necessarily. So I think all of those are ways. We can't be purists and we can't be isolationists. I will say, and maybe Barbara, a lot of the movements in Latin America have also relied on outside pressure. Now, I don't know how that works with the United States.
Yeah.
the undermining of the United Nations and all of that is a part of the difficulty of this moment as well. But all of these other moments, certainly the South African anti-apartheid movement, relied on international pressure in solidarity with the movement. So it was inside struggle, there was outside struggle. But I think there are forces in the world, watching the United States in horror and feeling very much in solidarity to movements that are resisting here. I just don't know how much leverage or power they have. But listen, the good news is, dictators rise, and pretty much to a person they fall. And sometimes their own internal contradictions contribute to that as much as external pressure. So I think we have to be persistent. We have to step into courage. We have to, involve ourselves in collective struggle with other people. And we have to be as broad as possible. So I don't think we have the luxury of cynicism.
Yeah.
We'll have to do the work.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. I completely agree. And, I think it's really crucial to remember that, this is, I think what's crucial to remember is that this could be just a moment, and a moment we will emerge from, but also to be alert to to the kinds of changes that are being made that could prolong this moment. I mean, I think I'm extremely supportive of California's Proposition 50. I think that that's the kind of thing, sort of the way in which the Trumpers are trying to kind of reshape the entire process, the voting process, is something to be especially alert to, because that's the sort of thing that, what you want to think about is what are they doing that could allow them to really get dug in to a way that it would be very difficult to dig them out. So that's one of the things to really be alert to.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that worked out almost perfectly. It's 6:59 on my watch. I know the hour's different in different time zones, but I want to thank both Barbaras, Barbara Ransby and Barbara Weinstein, for being with us today, helping to clarify some of the forces that we are up against, and giving us some good things to think about as far as resistance, and the kind of resistance that we need to be engaging in. And especially appreciated that reminder from Barbara Ransby that we don't have the luxury of cynicism in this moment. So thanks to everyone who's attended, and especially to our two Barbaras.
Thank you, Kevin.